have with me my colleague, a fellow distinguished fellow at ORF, Captain Raghu Raman. Captain Raghu Raman has spent 11 years with the Indian Army, close to 16 years in the corporate world, and 5 years as the CEO of National Intelligence Grid. He is much experienced in strategic affairs, in dealing with security issues, and he has a vast area of expertise on how to handle emerging security threats, both nationally and globally. Welcome, Captain Raghu Raman.
Thank you, Kanchan. I like that fellow, distinguished fellow. That was a nice, nice wordplay.
The COVID pandemic has clear national security implications. The Pentagon, for instance, has extended travel restrictions for its forces till June 30th. Over here, we keep on hearing about personnel of the Central Armed Police Forces falling victim to the pandemic because they are in the front line of fighting the virus. We are still not aware of how exposed our defense forces are. But what is your sense of the challenges that we face from the pandemic, and how best could those be handled?
Well, I mean, the forces are also consisting of human beings. They can also fall sick, as indeed armies all across the world, including the US Navy, as you've seen, has had a lot of infections. So to my mind, I think this is a virus which all organizations, including the armed forces, will have to just sail through. There will be some people who will be sick, some people who will recover. From what the signs look like in terms of how the pandemic is affecting people, by and large, people who are fit and healthy seem to be sailing through it. And by definition, therefore, the armed forces as a category would probably be less influenced because, as you're aware, they in terms of at least the physical and many other aspects of health, the armed forces are almost at the level of, you can say, sports people. So to that extent, I don't think this is a major cause of worry. The second aspect is the armed forces has been preparing for it. I'm aware that every garrison has put in certain quarantine areas, and there are processes that have been placed. Every soldier has been advised, even those who are on leave have been advised for the exact process of not just traveling, but also what kind of package they need to carry, how they need to pack their bags with the immediately required clothing in polythene, how they need to carry their food and not accept food from anyone else. So I think they've gone through a series of steps to avoid mass contamination. My sense is the armed forces are fully cognizant that in the end, this is a very, very virulent virus, and it'll spread very. The spread is very difficult to control. So eventually everyone will probably get it. But the idea is not to get it at once, and to ensure that the percentage of people who are unwell is well below the threshold. And to that extent, I think it's about as much of a worry for us as it is a worry for our adversaries.
As you have pointed out that some personnel of the Navy have been infected with the virus. This is at the Mumbai operations of the Indian Navy. But if you look at the three forces, which one do you think would be the most exposed to the virus, and which of the three forces would be the most vulnerable to the virus?
So I of course was referring to the US Navy, not the Indian Navy, but you're right that the Indian naval, but it's a ground establishment. It's not it's an onshore establishment, not a seaborne establishment where sailors have been have they contacted coronavirus. It's hard to say. I mean, going simply by the proximity, the units which are obviously living in close proximity. So soldiers who live in barracks, for example, or soldiers who are contained within garrisons. There are certain garrisons in India, you're aware, which have very close proximity of units from each other. And there are certain garrisons where you have spread out, like there are certain of our divisions which are spread out over various different cities. So obviously, the ones that are secluded from the main population will probably have a lower rate of contamination. But the fact remains that soldiers will return from leave, even though quarantine processes will be carried out, I'm certain. But there are very many cases of people who are silent carriers in that they don't display any outward sort of symptoms, but they still carry the virus. And organizations which are seaborne, for example, if a single sailor gets it within a sailing ship, it's very difficult for by sheer logistics for the sailors to be segregated from each other, as we saw even in the United States, one of the most resourceful navies of the world. They also went through this whole crisis. So I think the most vulnerable will continue to be probably, I mean, I'm just taking a shot here and it might be completely wrong, but probably the vessels, if they get contacted, because the spread will be very rapid. Next would be units which are in close proximity of each other, where they are in peace stations, they are in garrisons together, in the barracks and all of that. But I'm given to understand that commanding officers and officers at every level are taking great care to ensure that they have a quarantine area, and soldiers returning from leave are being put into those quarantine areas before they are being allowed to mix with the others. My sense is the Air Force would probably be the lowest affected, for the simple reason that their operations are, I mean, of course, it's not to say that they will not be affected, but since their operations are much more smaller units, you have the units are smaller, their support teams are smaller. And so even if there is a sort of a spread, it won't be a rapid pandemic wildfire kind of a spread. So to that extent, that would be my call. It's a straight proportion with proximity of quartering and deployment.
The Indian Army recently issued an advisory claiming that adversaries have been launching coronavirus-themed campaigns to infect our cyber infrastructure. In your experience, what are some of the blind spots in our capacity to deal with such attacks?
So our adversaries have been launching various different social engineered attacks. It's nothing new. They do that. They've been doing it for years together, ever since the social media sort of came into the hands of Jawans and officers, and smartphone became ubiquitous. They've been doing that, and they usually ride on a wave of something, like most social engineering attacks. They always ride on a wave of something which is clickbaity, which people will surely click. Like if a meme were to go out that lockdown 5 is going to be announced tomorrow at so and so time, or new drug has been found which actually does this, a lot of people will click on it and they will take it at face value. So to that extent, any new sort of headline which appears or anything of that is of concern has always been used by our adversaries, notably, of course.
So basically, it is fake news by another name. So you have to deal with it.
It is fake news with another game. So fake news with a more I would say targeted objective. Now our adversaries have been infiltrating into our WhatsApp groups. They have been infiltrating into our email chains. They've been doing all of that, and to a certain extent, one has to give the devil his due. They are pretty good at these kind of things. Now, the point is that a lot of these attacks are not technology-based attacks. They are not somebody hacking into your phone or getting inside and rooting it or something. More of it is inadvertently the user of the phone or the user of the laptop themselves allowing such a element to come in. Like we are all aware that there are PDF files, or there are movies, or there are even free softwares which are Trojan. I mean, they have a ulterior sort of a software which is sitting inside it. It's silk roped. That's a technical term, that you basically encapsulate one of these malignant Trojans or viruses into a program which is otherwise, it could be a movie, it could be a pornographic clip, or anything that will get the user to sort of click on it or do some activity on it. So a lot of it is social engineering, and social engineering, the only method to really overcome that is basically a lot more awareness, lot more education. Having said that, social engineering attacks can never really be totally stopped, because if you totally stop clicking on anything that comes to you, that is the only short way of stopping it. So to a large extent, I think it's to make people aware that they should be cautious of the kind of information that they receive. And if something sounds too outlandish to be true, then it probably is not true. And I think that logic is something that has to be sort of kept in mind. But in terms of the actual capability to stop such kind of messages, I don't think any army or any institution of the world has that, unless you go with completely encrypted phones. And I know that certain governments are still following very, very encrypted channels using Blackberries in some cases. But if you're talking of the open source, if you're talking of Facebook, you're talking of social media, it is next to impossible to
how vulnerable are our forces to these kind of attacks? I mean, designed attacks to demoralize them, or to sort of to make them feel devastated, because these are not very happy times.
I don't think the troops are going to, I mean, you see the kind of nonsense that keeps appearing, even other than the coronavirus. A lot of divisive messages keep coming, and this has been happening from many, many years, that our adversaries will pit one religion against the other. They will show pictures of a particular minority being, whatever. So they'll do all of these kind of things to try and make a person worried. And like any individual, soldiers can also get worried. But unit CEOs, commanding officers, company commanders, other officers. And by the way, I mean, the Jawan of today is not the Jawan of 20 years ago. He's also very, very aware. He's very tech savvy. He knows what is plausible, what is possible, and what is probable. So to a certain extent, I think we are not, I would say we are not that vulnerable as perhaps we were maybe about 15 years ago, when the internet and hacking and all of that was just beginning. Most of our soldiers are fairly tech savvy. Most of them realize they're all very well briefed. The drills are very good and strong. Whenever Jawans are going soldiers are going on leave, they are briefed before they go. When they come back, they are again debriefed. Questions are asked whether they were contacted by somebody, or is there something that is perturbing them, that's bothering them. There are mechanisms in the forces whereby there are regular, sort of Sainik Sammelans where the Jawans can express their concerns, and that concerns will be addressed by officers and all of that. So I think to a large extent, disinformation campaign is nothing new for the armed forces. We have handled it for decades.
Captain Raghu Raman, something which has sort of bothered many of us, and it has sort of led to a certain amount of concern too. We have seen people setting themselves on security forces. I mean, in this case, basically policemen and police forces, who have been on the front line, and all that they were trying to do was to impose lockdown restrictions. And they have been attacked, and they have been mercilessly beaten up. And a remarkable restraint has been shown by the police forces because of the situation that prevails. But despite that, and it's not just one incident, it's happened in state after state, it's happened in UP, in Maharashtra, in MP, it's happened in West Bengal, where we have seen a pretty ghastly incident in Howrah. And somehow there seems to be no effort to bring these culprits to book. Okay, they are arrested or they are picked up, but after that, what? There has to be some deterrence after all.
I won't be qualified to comment on the deterrence factor. That is something for an administrator or somebody from the legal system to comment on. I can just say this, that whenever, by the way, the police, this is nothing new. Whenever police is trying to, or for that matter, any law enforcement authority. I mean, I've been in aid to civil authorities during the Mandal Commission. Whenever you are trying to implement the law and the rules, there are oftentimes, there is a dissonance between the law and its applicability, and sometimes the people's acceptance of that law. For instance, if you we have to look at both ends of the spectrum. If, for instance, you quarantine a set of people inside a certain space and don't allow them to just get the basics and sort of compress them into that, build up that pressure day after day after day, sometimes the pressure will explode. On the other hand, there are always some miscreants who want to leverage these kind of situations. Sometimes they were even sort of agent provocators who use these opportunities to make sure that the situation exacerbates and goes out of control. There have been many instances, not just now, in the past also. We've seen that even in Delhi, we have seen that during a skirmish between a mob, crowd and police, somebody suddenly opens fire from within the mob, and that suddenly leads to a stampede and stuff like that. So this is a reality of law enforcement. And this is not so much about making an example only in this case. I mean, I used to always have when people used to ask me, why don't we have zero tolerance to terrorism? My response to them used to be that, how can you have zero tolerance to terrorism in a country which is tolerant of every other crime? So if it takes 7 to 8 years to hang 4 rapists, 5 rapists, and then to say that within you need a swift from the occasion of the misdemeanor or breaking of the law till justice, you need a very swift exemplary movement. It becomes difficult to just pick out one instance and say, in this case, it should be fast, but in rape, it is okay. In murder, it is okay. You can't do that. So either the entire judicial system, I won't even say judicial system because I don't want to blame any, or
the criminal justice system,
the civic sense, the civic system of our nation, the tolerance level of people to say that if a crime is committed, between the crime and the actual punishment, it's okay to continue the cases for a few decades. So if you're accepting of that, then we are condoning. As citizens, we are condoning. We make the necessary noises, of course. Whenever these things happen, there are comments that come out and editorials that are written. But if in 70 years it hasn't changed, it basically means people have accepted it. And to my mind, if any society does not change something dramatically, drastically, then they're accepting it. I mean, you can look at several other examples. For example, we went self-reliant in terms of food, in terms of milk. We didn't accept it. So we made changes and made it happen. We were denied cryogenic technology by the Russians. We didn't accept it. We built our own missiles. We were denied the supercomputer by the Americans. We didn't accept it. We made our own supercomputer. So if anything does not happen to a certain extent, I believe that the society is accepting it. So I don't think this is a peculiar case of now. And I also don't think just by throwing a few people in jail or doing some exemplary punishment, we will prove anything. I think this is a cleansing that has to happen across the board. It has to happen, the civic sense, there has to be a civic sense. So if somebody is beating up the police, there are hundreds of civilians who are watching it. Why don't they step up? Now, by the same logic, when a girl is being teased, there are hundreds of civilians who are standing and watching it, but they don't step up then either. So my point is that this is a social issue that needs to be resolved. And it can't be resolved on a case-to-case basis.
Now that we have sort of seen the many ways in which a pandemic impacts national life, the way in which it impacts policy, the way in which it impacts concerns and worries, would you suggest that we should now start factoring in public health, or public health in terms of a sudden appearance of a pandemic as part of strategizing India's security?
It is not necessary to wait for a pandemic to make that happen. We are all aware that
now that it has happened.
No, I'm saying a fairly large percentage. Firstly, what is national security? National security is not just about the army and missiles and nuclear weapons. National security is linked to the hip with economic security. The power of a nation doesn't flow from the barrel of a gun. It actually flows from its reserves of resources, which includes its GDP. So an economically strong country is the only country which can be powerful. You cannot, you can have an exception of a country which is like bleeding away, but still having some legacy relevance, like some of the East European countries. But frankly speaking, no country in the world can call itself a powerful country by simply a strong army. Firstly, you can't have a strong army if you don't have a strong economy. I mean, if you're cutting your resources for the armed forces, then you cannot be a strong nation anyways. So I think when we look at national security, we have to look at several different components, and one of the components is the health of the citizens. Now, if you have a population of a country where a large percentage is malnutrition, you know that the large percentage of children are malnutrition, large percentage of the next generation are very weak, large percentage of the current generation are suffering from debilitating illnesses which reduce their potential, sort of potential of exploitation in a nice way for the country, for the nation. If a person has got only a longitude of say 60 years before he or she is affected by diabetes and heart diseases and then becomes a drain on the society, vis-a-vis another nation where health is given so much of importance that people are productive up to the age of 80, that latter nation will definitely be strong. So public health has never ever been out of the ambit of national security and national sort of strength. That is for sure. It is nothing new. But the good news, if you can always, I am an optimist, so I look for a silver lining everywhere. And in another sort of webinar, I was asked this question that do you think the corona is a bio weapon? Do you think it's a weapon of war? My point to that was that whether it's a weapon of war or not, the response to it is the same. The response is we need better health facilities at the micro level, at the street level. We need better hygiene habits. Health is not just medicines. Health is also hygiene. Health is education. Health is having better nutrition for mothers so that the children are stronger and they are more immune. It is spreading better nutrition across the population, not just having one minority which is well fed with organic food and all, and the majority which is subsisting on basic under-nutrition food, under-vitamined sort of food. So very clearly, to my mind, this pandemic has brought that issue to the fore, that you cannot have a country which is strong, which does not dedicate a fair amount of its resources to health. And by health, again, I want to reiterate, I don't mean just hospitals and nursing homes and mohalla clinics. I mean the entire value chain of health, which starts from basic hygiene, which starts from accommodation and living space, where there is a focus on health, which starts from encouraging sports amongst children so that they are stronger. All of these things contribute to health. It's not just inoculations and
now,
injections.
In the context of what you said, and also in the context of there is this growing realization that you cannot, just as now we have started including water, we have started including food into the overall national security strategy. Don't you think it's time we started looking at public health as integral to national security strategy formulation? And as part of that, should the NATGRID should it be expanded to include organizations like ICMR and other organizations which are involved with dealing with public health emergencies?
So to answer the first part of your question, national health has always been a part of national security in terms of its strategic studies. Now, whether it is included, paid attention to, focused on or not is a different issue. Insofar, the second part of the question, I am, of course, very, very far removed from NATGRID now. It's been 5 years since I have left. So that has possibly changed in its avatars quite a bit. But I would say, for a government to be able to make intelligent decisions, they need to have all the data available to them, and data which is contextualized. So if you have, let's say, I'll give you a very simple example to illustrate this point. So if you have a particular town or a particular city which is getting criminalized and organized crime is taking over that city, then there are certain early indicators of that. Any city where organized crime, or a small town where organized crime is taking over, minor robberies will stop, chain snatching will stop because the gangs are taking over the place. These kind of minor petty crime will stop, and these are early indicators. Now, if you have the ability to fuse that kind of data in one single dashboard, it throws in insights. It shows you unarticulated connections. It shows you connections which are not obvious. Now, that kind of a dashboard is necessary for any policy decision maker. There's no doubt about that. So at a macro level, if the question is that shouldn't public health be part of that data set, which gives a bird's eye view and enables a person to sit back and take a look at the big picture and find out where the blockage is taking place. So the answer to that is a no-brainer, that it definitely needs to be part of that. There are databases which are out there. The unfortunate part of India is actually threefold. Firstly, most of our databases, the fidelity is highly suspect, because if you just take two major databases which are supposed to tell the same thing, you will find there is a dissonance between that also. The second is a lot of them are still not digitized. So they are still in paper records and all of that. And the third one is, of course, they are not ever fused together. They are never brought together to be able to see what is the connection of A with B. And therefore, a lot of intelligence, raw intelligence, falls into the cracks. Now, you don't have to go very far. Let me give you a very simple example for me to illustrate this point. Let's take the armed forces, since we were talking about the armed forces. We've got 15 lakh soldiers in the army alone. And if you add up, say, the soldiers who retired maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, you'll easily arrive up to 20 lakh in terms of the, sort of, I call it the control group, who come from each and every district and village of this country. They are also a group whose medical records for the last 20 years, every year's medical record is available. Now, if you just looked at this data, you would be able to figure out which district of India is getting iodine deficiency, which district is having arsenic into the water body, where is the bone density changing. Now, this is data that is very clearly available for the government and the policymakers to get a sort of a picture of the health of India in terms of the macro problems of what is happening in India. But the data just lies there. It's not being used. It's not being fused. So I think these are the real challenges. The challenge is not to include the ICMR. The challenge is to say that what are we doing with the databases that we already have? We have literally gold mines on which we sit and we do nothing with it.
Okay, a quick last question. I don't want to get into conspiracy theories, whether this was some kind of a germ warfare that has gone wrong or some lab test which has gone wrong. But if we look at the pandemic, the manner in which it has panned out, the impact it has had, impact in real terms, impact in terms of the fear it has unleashed, the immobilizing effect of it. Are there lessons to be learned for dealing with an engineered germ warfare or a biological attack if India were to face one?
Okay, so this actually has three answers to it. First, I want to sort of put it on the table that usually biological warfare is not resorted to by nation states, because no nation state wants to create a weapon that it itself cannot control. Even if you look at the nuclear development of nuclear technology, the yield is being reduced over a period of time. So you want to create a tactical nuclear bomb that you can drop into a specific area and only destroy that area and not have the radiation effect affecting your own population. So very clearly, any weapon system that cannot be controlled to that fine tuning is usually not preferred by military commanders themselves. Having said that, biological warfare has always been the penchant for terrorists, because that's what they want. They want an uncontrollable and actually some of the more successful, quote unquote, successful terror attacks or attacks using biowar have been conducted by terrorists. So whether it was the sarin gas released in the Tokyo subway, or the anthrax which was found in envelopes and all of that, these are all you can date back or you can trace back to terror organizations. The second point, that should we consider this as a potential threat vector? Of course we should. And the answer to that, as I said earlier, you do not need a threat vector to come to start improving the health facilities and having the adequate amount of hospital beds and adequate amount of health infrastructure in any case. So if there is a certain ratio that doctors to citizens, hospitals beds to citizens, ventilators to citizens, which is supposed to be an ideal ratio, then that should be done in any case. It should not be because germ warfare can be a vector.
No, it's not. It's not. Frankly, it's not only about the physical infrastructure in terms of hospitals and ICUs and ventilators. It's also about
psychological
in a state of preparedness.
Yeah.
Like
so,
PPEs.
I think
we were caught on the wrong foot. We didn't have PPEs. So do we now start stocking up on PPEs, imagining a scenario where we may be under attack? Do we now start stocking up on masks, on gloves, or whatever?
Yeah. I mean, so I don't think that's the way to ever think of strategy, especially national security strategy. Then you go back to that old, so there is a time when aircrafts used to be hijacked and bombed because people wore, explosives inside their shoes, and shoes were removed and checked, and all the shoes of the 9/11 attackers were removed and checked. And what did they do? They took the plane and converted that into a bomb. So very clearly, you cannot fight the battle of the future with the past experience. So you can't say, okay, let's stock up on PPE and let's stock up on this. What do you know? Tomorrow the poisoning could happen through food. It could happen through water. So then you'll have to stock up on water filters also. So eventually what will happen is that if you take your nation's resources and keep stocking it up on preventive measures whose probability of occurrence is going to be low, you will in any case collapse. And a case in example is the 26/11 attack. Now 26/11 caused a particular set of casualties, 168, 170 odd casualties. But what it did is, in perpetuity, it created so much of friction into the system. Each time you enter into a 5-star hotel and pay for a cup of coffee, there is a surcharge that has been added to that coffee because of that attack and the DFMD and the dogs that roam around, the increase of guards. Each time you buy an air ticket, there is a surcharge that has been added to it because of the security checks that have to be done, and therefore utilization of that aircraft has been slowed down. So every such attack will basically take sand and throw it into the system, and it will make the works even more and more sort of introduce friction and make it slower and slower. And that is another way to actually bring down a nation. So I think at some level, life has to go on. You have to look at countries like, I don't like taking Israel's example because Israel is a very different situation. But in this particular instance, it's a war zone country, but life goes on. They don't jam up life because they are under threat. And that's the way to look at it. In these kind of situation also, this is a minefield situation. Actually, it's a very interesting analogy. This is a minefield situation. So when soldiers are confronted with a minefield, it is, of course, a very, very serious threat. It can cause casualties, and psychologically it is, very alarming. But eventually, if you don't have time and if you have to mount an attack, the way minefields are crossed is that the infantry gets into an extended line and they just storm across. And when they storm across, there will be casualties. There is no doubt. But I mean, one of the densest minefields in the world was in Alamein during the Second World War. And in the densest minefield in the world, the casualties were 20% by the mines. So very clearly, when you are faced with a situation, most tough decisions, as you know, Kanchan, in life are not between a right and a wrong. It is between one right and another right. Now, if you have a situation where you are confronted with some sort of a threat and a blockage, at some point of time, you have to trade off and say that, do I keep investing more and more and more in resources which are likely to happen because they happened earlier? Or is that resource going away into each time we raise, for example, a new battalion, you will take away 800 able-bodied people who should have become teachers, doctors, plumbers, and give them a piece of metal and they stand around for 20 years of their life. So the point is that a society cannot keep taking its resources and putting it in preparation for war. If it keeps doing that, then that is a success of the adversary anyway. The adversary has pinned down your productive resources in something which is not productive. And in that manner, he is defeated.
That's a very convincing argument. And on that note, I'm sorry we have run out of time, so this conversation ends. And I'm sure people who are watching it and people who will watch it will find your views very useful to understand the crisis that we face and the crisis that lie ahead. Thank you once again.
Thank you,
Captain.
Kanchan. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with
Thank
you.
you for your.
Thank you. Have a great evening and take care.